June 15, 1944. The waters of the Pacific shimmered beneath the pale light of dawn, but for the men crowded into the landing craft, there was no beauty in the morning. Ahead of them lay Saipan, a volcanic island ringed with reefs, jagged cliffs, and beaches already blackened by days of bombardment. For the Marines of the U.S. 2nd and 4th Divisions, this was the latest step in a campaign that had carried them from Guadalcanal, through Tarawa, and across the Marshall Islands. But what awaited them here would prove far greater in both scale and consequence. From pillboxes buried in the sand, Japanese sentries peered through firing slits, scanning the horizon. They had been told to expect waves of infantry, as always, unarmored men forced to crawl across the coral reefs, stumbling in the surf, easy prey for machine guns and artillery. Their commanders had assured them that the reefs, which stretched hundreds of yards from shore, would halt any American armor. Tanks, they believed, could never roll through the sea. Yet as the light rose and the invasion fleet drew closer, shapes began to appear, first as dark smudges against the glimmer of the ocean, then as distinct silhouettes. They were not mere boats. These were hulking, steel-clad machines, riding low in the water, but pressing forward with relentless determination. Tracks churned beneath the waves, propelling them over the reefs. Gun turrets swiveled, and flashes of orange burst from their barrels. The Americans had brought tanks that could swim. The Japanese defenders had never seen such a thing. The LVT Amphibious tractors armed with 75mm howitzers lumbered toward the beaches, belching fire at pillboxes and machine gun nests. What the defenders had believed impossible was now unfolding before their eyes. Steel beasts rising from the sea, armored and unstoppable. For a brief moment, shock and disbelief rippled through the ranks of men dug into Saipan's defenses. The impregnable line was not impregnable after all. For the Marines inside the LVTs, the experience was no less surreal. Packed tightly within the steel hulls, they felt each shudder of the machine as waves slapped against the armor. Water seeped in through seams. The smell of oil and cordite mingled with the salt spray. Overhead, naval shells screamed inland, detonating against the ridges that overlooked the landing beaches. The roar of explosions and the rattle of automatic weapons fire blended into a wall of sound. It was an orchestra of war, and the LVTs were the leading instruments in a grim new movement. The arrival of the amphibious tanks on Saipan was more than just a tactical surprise. It was a symbol of the growing industrial might and innovation of the United States at this stage of the Pacific War. In 1942, at Guadalcanal, American Marines had gone ashore in open boats, fighting with little more than rifles and grenades against entrenched Japanese defenders. At Tarawa in 1943, armored Shermans had been brought forward, but the coral reef had stranded many of them offshore, leaving men to wade through hundreds of yards of water under withering fire. Losses there had been appalling. The lesson had been clear. If the United States was to continue its island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, it needed machines that could carry both armor and firepower across reefs and directly onto hostile beaches. The solution came from a machine that had once been written off as ungainly and impractical. The landing vehicle, tracked, the amphibious tractor, or Amtrak, was originally conceived as a rescue vehicle for Florida swamps. By 1944, it had been transformed into a weapon of war. Some variants carried troops. Others carried heavy guns in armored turrets. Together, they represented a revolution in amphibious assault. Saipan was the first time these machines would be unleashed on a massive scale. Over 700 LVTs were deployed in the initial waves. grinding forward through the surf, smashing through wire and mines, and silencing pillboxes before the infantry behind them even reached the beach. For the Japanese, who had counted on the reefs as their natural barrier, it was a devastating revelation. Their plans had not accounted for this, and from the very first hour of battle, the fortress of Saipan was compromised. Yet the battle for Saipan was not simply about technology or tactics. It was about strategy, geography, and the survival of empires. To Tokyo, Saipan was not just another island. It was a cornerstone of Japan's defensive perimeter, a shield that protected the Marianas and, beyond them, the home islands themselves. Its loss would mean that American bombers, the new long-range B-29 superfortresses, could strike directly at Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. Saipan was the line that could not be broken. To Washington and to Admiral Chester Nimitz, Saipan was the key to accelerating the end of the war. Control of the Marianas would sever Japan's communications, cripple its supply lines, and allow the United States to launch the strategic bombing campaign that would devastate the Japanese war economy. In June 1944, as Allied armies stormed ashore in Normandy, thousands of miles away, another great invasion was unfolding in the Pacific, one that would prove just as consequential for the outcome of the global conflict. The clash on Saipan was more than just a battle between two armies. It was a collision between two visions of war, one rooted in modern mechanization, industrial innovation, and overwhelming firepower. The other in fortified defenses, desperate courage, and the willingness to die to the last man. At the center of that collision, on the morning of June 15th, were the steel beasts that rose from the sea and crushed the myth of invulnerability. As the LVTs clawed their way onto the sand, their guns firing into concrete bunkers, the Marines within them prepared to spill out and fight for every yard of beach. Behind them, the ocean stretched back to the horizon, filled with warships and transports. Before them, the island rose steeply, crowned with cliffs and ridges where Japanese guns still waited. The battle had only begun, and already it was clear. Saipan would be a struggle unlike any other. This was the crucible in which amphibious warfare would be tested on its grandest scale, and where innovation would clash with desperation in a fight to decide the fate of the Pacific. The beaches of Saipan, scarred by shellfire and churned by steel tracks, would become the proving ground for America's amphibious tanks and a harbinger of Japan's coming defeat. When the last echoes of gunfire faded over the beaches of Tarawa in November 1943, the United States Marine Corps had paid a terrible price for just 2 square miles of coral sand. Nearly 1,200 Americans lay dead, more than 2,000 wounded, and the reef-strewn lagoon was choked with bodies and wreckage. Yet Tarawa had given Washington more than a victory. It had given hard lessons. The American public was shocked at the losses for such a tiny island, but the operation proved that the concept of amphibious assault could succeed against fortified Japanese positions. It also revealed that if the United States intended to advance deeper across the Central Pacific, each new step would demand larger forces, greater coordination, and sharper innovation. From Tarawa, the Americans surged westward, seizing the Marshall Islands in early 1944. At Kwajalein, Roy Namur, and Eniwetok, the lessons of Tarawa were applied with ruthless efficiency. Amphibious landings became better rehearsed. Naval bombardments lengthened and intensified. The chain of stepping stones toward Japan was being laid. But the next step, the Marianas, and especially Saipan, would mark a dramatic escalation in both risk and reward. To the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Marianas represented far more than another island group. From their airfields, the new Boeing B-29 Superfortress could reach Tokyo itself. No longer would raids be limited to outposts on the periphery of Japan's empire. The very heart of the nation would lie within range. Capturing the Marianas would also sever Japan's communication lines from the Central Pacific to Southeast Asia, tightening the noose on its overstretched empire. Yet there was disagreement about the timing and the means. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Ocean areas, advocated a direct thrust across the Central Pacific, using the Navy and Marine Corps to smash through Japan's island bastions. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific Area, argued instead for a return to the Philippines, a campaign that would liberate American territory and restore his own prestige. The debate was fierce, fought not only in planning rooms, but in Washington's corridors of power. In the end, the Joint Chiefs sided with Nimitz, though MacArthur's eventual return to the Philippines would still be guaranteed. The Marianas would be invaded in mid-1944, under the codename Operation Forager. It was a decision with profound consequences. For the first time in the Pacific War, American forces would strike at a territory politically inseparable from the Japanese homeland. Saipan was part of the South Seas Mandate, administered by Tokyo under a League of Nations agreement since 1919. To lose Saipan would not simply be a military setback, it would be a direct assault on Japanese sovereignty. On the Japanese side, this reality was not lost. The Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo regarded the Marianas as the absolute defense zone. If Saipan fell, the home islands would be within bomber range. The Navy pressed to commit its combined fleet to a decisive showdown in the waters of the Marianas, a battle they hoped would reverse the tide of the war. General Yoshitsugu Saito, appointed commander of Saipan's garrison, was told bluntly, "There could be no retreat, no surrender. Saipan must be held at all costs, or Japan's defensive line would collapse." Thus, as 1944 opened, two strategies converged on a single island. For the United States, Saipan was the stepping stone that would open the gates to Japan. For Tokyo, it was the gate itself, a threshold beyond which defeat loomed inevitable. The logistics of Operation Forager were immense. Saipan lay more than 1,500 miles west of Pearl Harbor and 1,200 miles from the Marshalls. To project force at such a distance required a fleet of staggering size. Over 500 ships were assembled: battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, transports, oilers, and hospital ships, carrying more than 127,000 men. The landing force alone, comprising the U.S. 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions and the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division, totaled over 71,000 troops. Their commander was Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith, the fiery Marine known as Howlin' Mad. Above him, overall command rested with Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, famed for his calm mastery at the Battle of Midway. Preparation was meticulous. Naval construction battalions, the Seabees, stockpiled landing craft, bulldozers, and prefabricated airstrips. Amphibious tractors were overhauled, and new LVT models with armored turrets and howitzers were rushed into production. Airfields in the Marshalls buzzed with bombers softening Japanese positions across the Marianas. Submarines prowled the waters, sinking Japanese transports and oilers, strangling the empire's lifeline to its southern resources. Every arm of the American war machine was mobilized for the assault. For the Japanese, resources were far thinner. Saipan's garrison of roughly 30,000 troops was heavily armed with artillery, mortars, and machine guns, but isolated. The Imperial Navy planned to sail its combined fleet to the Marianas once the invasion began, hoping to draw the Americans into a climactic carrier battle. But their fuel reserves were dwindling, and many of their aviators were poorly trained replacements for the men lost in earlier clashes. Still, Tokyo staked everything on the idea that one decisive battle could halt America's advance. The stakes were therefore nothing less than the future of the Pacific War. If Saipan could be held, Japan might buy time to fortify its defenses, perhaps even force negotiations. If it was lost, the home islands themselves would be exposed. For the United States, success would mean bases from which to bomb Japan relentlessly, perhaps shortening the war by years. On June 11, 1944, the operation began with preliminary airstrikes. Carrier aircraft pounded the Marianas, destroying Japanese planes on the ground and in the air. By June 13th, American battleships were in range, unleashing a bombardment that shook the earth. The stage was set. The largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific to date was about to begin. The road to Saipan was not simply one of geography, but of strategy, politics, and necessity. Both nations recognized the island's importance. For the United States, it was a doorway into the heart of the Japanese Empire. For Japan, it was the wall that kept the enemy at bay. And when the wall was breached, the entire war would tilt toward its fateful conclusion. From a distance, Saipan looked deceptively tranquil. A volcanic island just 12 miles long and 5 miles wide, its slopes were carpeted with palm groves, sugarcane fields, and small villages. But beneath the green canopy and inside the rugged ridgelines, a fortress had been carved. In early 1944, as American bombers began to circle ever closer, Japanese engineers and soldiers transformed Saipan into a bastion designed to repel any landing. Commanding the island was Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, a career officer in the Imperial Japanese Army. He had under his authority approximately 30,000 men, a mix of army troops, naval personnel, and conscripted laborers. Saito was supported by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the naval commander who had once led the attack on Pearl Harbor, but now found himself stranded on land, far from the sea power that had made Japan formidable. Together, their orders were unequivocal: hold Saipan to the last man. The Japanese defenses reflected this mandate. Along the shoreline, hundreds of pillboxes, casemates, and blockhouses dotted the beaches. Many were reinforced with concrete and buried so deep into the sand that only narrow firing slits betrayed their presence. They were positioned in interlocking arcs, ensuring that machine gun fire swept the landing zones in deadly crossfire. Behind the beaches, artillery batteries were dug into the cliffs overlooking the coastline. Guns ranged from 75mm field pieces to heavy 150mm cannons, most carefully concealed in caves or camouflaged by vegetation. On the southern end of the island, near Charan Kanoa, where the Americans were most likely to land, engineers had reinforced natural ridges into defensive strongpoints. Trenches zigzagged between positions, while minefields and barbed wire choked the approaches. On the northern tip, at Marpi Point, cliffs provided natural barriers, later to become sites of tragic civilian suicides. Every feature of terrain had been studied and armed, yet the Japanese confidence rested on a critical assumption: that American armor could not cross the coral reefs that ringed Saipan's shores. At Tarawa and other islands, tanks had indeed become stranded, easy prey for defenders. Thus, while the beaches were fortified against infantry, The defenses were not designed to withstand armored vehicles rolling directly out of the sea. This single miscalculation would prove catastrophic. In the months leading up to the invasion, Japanese soldiers labored day and night to complete the fortifications. Civilians, Chamorro Islanders, Koreans, and Japanese settlers were forced to dig trenches, haul supplies, and construct air raid shelters. Children carried sandbags, women cooked for the troops. Fear spread among them as rumors circulated of the brutal fate that awaited if Americans landed. Tokyo propaganda painted the enemy as merciless barbarians, fueling dread and a willingness to resist at any cost. The soldiers themselves prepared with grim resolve. Rations were scarce. Supplies from Japan were increasingly cut off by American submarines, which prowled the seas with deadly efficiency. But morale was hardened by ideology. The spirit of Gyokusai, to die like shattered jewels, permeated the garrison. It was better to perish in defense of the emperor than to live in disgrace. General Saito drilled this into his men, reminding them that surrender was unthinkable. If Saipan was lost, Japan itself would be vulnerable. Within the island's caves, stockpiles of ammunition and food were concealed, intended to allow defenders to wage a protracted struggle. Tunnels linked firing positions, so that units could withdraw unseen and re-emerge to strike again. Hidden mortars were calibrated on the beaches, waiting for coordinates to unleash deadly fire on landing craft. Japanese engineers even flooded low-lying fields, hoping to bog down tanks should they somehow reach inland. The defensive preparations were not purely military. Civil defense committees organized civilians into work battalions. Leaflets and broadcasts urged families to commit suicide rather than fall into American hands. Schools were closed, their children sent to carry supplies or dig ditches. The line between soldier and civilian blurred, as Saipan's population became unwilling participants in the island's transformation into a fortress. Inside the garrison, soldiers faced long nights of labor, punctuated by air raid sirens. American aircraft from the Marshalls began to strike in early 1944, forcing the defenders to live underground. Diaries recovered after the battle describe exhaustion, hunger, and resignation. One Japanese private wrote, "The enemy comes closer each day. We dig, we build, but the sky is filled with their planes. We know we will not leave this island alive." Still, there was determination. The Japanese plan was simple: bleed the Americans at the beaches, then counterattack with ferocity. Once the enemy was ashore, defenders would launch night raids, infiltrate behind lines, and mount banzai charges to drive them back into the sea. It was a formula rooted in the experience of earlier battles and in the faith that sheer willpower could overcome American material superiority. Yet beneath this resolve lurked cracks. Ammunition stocks were limited, and gasoline was scarce. The island's small tank force, around 44 Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks, was outdated compared to American Shermans. The airfields, Aslito and Marpi, were vulnerable to carrier raids, and Japanese pilots were increasingly green. The garrison's strength was formidable on paper, but fragile in reality. The contrast between appearances and reality was stark. To the American planners studying reconnaissance photographs, Saipan looked like a fortress that would exact a terrible price. To the Japanese soldiers digging beneath the palm trees, it felt like a place of destiny, where they would fight, and likely die, for the emperor. But beneath the surface, the fortress was built on flawed assumptions. When the American fleet finally appeared on the horizon in June 1944, Many Japanese soldiers believed they were ready. Machine gun barrels had been oiled. Mortars were zeroed in. Artillery crews sat by their guns, waiting for the signal to fire. Saito himself declared that the island would become the graveyard of the American Marines. But he and his men had not accounted for the steel beasts that churned through the surf. Amphibious tanks that could crawl over reefs, shrug off small arms fire, and blast apart the pillboxes that had been designed for a different war. The defenders had prepared for war. The fortress of Saipan was formidable, but it was built for the wrong kind of enemy. And that miscalculation would set the stage for the island's fall, and for the tragedy that engulfed both soldiers and civilians in the weeks to come. In the spring of 1944, while Japanese engineers dug ever deeper into the coral ridges of Saipan, the United States was perfecting the tools that would soon challenge their fortress. Across bases in Hawaii, the Marshalls, and Pearl Harbor, the largest amphibious force yet assembled prepared for the assault. At the heart of this force were the ungainly, steel-tracked amphibians that Marines had come to know as Amtraks. The landing vehicle, tracked, or LVT, had not been born in the crucible of war, but in the swamps of Florida. In the 1930s, engineer Donald Roebling designed a vehicle to rescue hurricane victims from flooded terrain. Its strange, boxy hull rode on wide tracks that churned through water as easily as over sand. The U.S. Marine Corps, searching for a solution to the perennial problem of amphibious landings, quickly recognized its potential. By the time the United States entered the war, prototypes were being adapted for combat. The first major combat use of LVTs came at Tarawa in 1943. There, the reef that surrounded Betio Atoll stranded conventional Higgins boats hundreds of yards from shore, forcing Marines to wade through waist-deep water under withering Japanese fire. Casualties were horrendous, but the handful of LVTs available had crawled over the reef and carried men directly onto the beaches. Their success, though limited by small numbers, convinced American planners that more of these machines would be essential for future assaults. By mid-1944, two main models were in service. The LVT-2, nicknamed the Water Buffalo, could carry a squad of Marines and their gear from ship to shore. Its open cargo well exposed troops to enemy fire, but its ability to cross reefs made it invaluable. The other variant, the LVT-A4, was a true amphibious assault vehicle. It mounted a turret from the M8 75mm howitzer motor carriage, giving it a weapon capable of blasting concrete pillboxes and dugouts. Machine guns added further firepower. Together, these two vehicles represented a leap in amphibious warfare. No longer would Marines face beaches defended by unchecked bunkers. Now, armor would meet the enemy head-on. In Hawaii, throughout early 1944, Marines trained with these new machines. On Oahu's beaches, squads practiced clambering in and out of the Amtraks, weapons held high, rehearsing the mad dash across sand already imagined as hostile ground. Mechanics worked long hours in workshops, stripping engines, testing track links, and welding armor plates. The LVTs were notorious for their mechanical fragility. Salt water corroded metal, and engines often overheated. Every machine that would be sent to Saipan had to be inspected, repaired, and tested before loading. Commanders, too, refined doctrine. Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith, nicknamed Howlin' Mad for both his fiery temper and relentless drive, was determined not to repeat Tarawa. At his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, he reviewed after-action reports, line by line. Where Tarawa's planners had relied on infantry to clear bunkers with grenades and flamethrowers, Smith insisted that amphibious armor must now lead the way. The LVTAs would be in the very first wave, firing as they crossed the reef, blasting Japanese pillboxes before the infantry ever reached the beach. "The tanks will clear the way," Smith declared. "The men will hold it." Smith was not alone in this determination. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, overall commander of the Fifth Fleet, and Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, master of amphibious operations, shared the conviction that the invasion had to be planned with overwhelming force. Saipan would be defended far more heavily than Tarawa. It demanded not only massed firepower, but also the careful integration of ships, planes, and armored vehicles. The amphibious team that the Marine Corps had envisioned before the war was finally becoming reality. As the LVTs were prepared, so too were the men who would ride them into battle. In the camps of Hawaii, Marines studied sand tables of Saipan's beaches, memorizing landmarks and objectives. Night exercises tested their ability to load into Amtraks in darkness, ride through surf, and hit the sand at a run. The sound of shouted commands, grinding tracks, and roaring engines became the soundtrack of preparation. One private later recalled his first sight of the LVT. "It looked like a box on tracks, like something thrown together in a machine shop. But when they told us it could climb reefs and take us straight onto the beach, we didn't care what it looked like. We just hoped it would work." That sentiment captured the Marines' relationship with the vehicle. Awkward, noisy, but potentially life-saving. Meanwhile, the Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, labored to prepare logistical support. Massive floating dry docks were assembled in the marshals to service the fleet. Depots stocked thousands of drums of fuel, spare track links, and replacement engines for the LVTs. Operation Forager would carry more than 127,000 men across an ocean, and every item, from rations to bulldozers, had to be in place. The planning maps spread across the tables of Pearl Harbor represented one of the most complex amphibious undertakings in history. Air power, too, played its part in preparation. Long-range bombers struck at Saipan and the surrounding Marianas, softening defenses and disrupting Japanese communications. Carrier pilots rehearsed strikes against mock targets, while Marine aviators studied close air support coordination with the advancing Amtraks. The doctrine of combined arms, infantry, armor, artillery, naval gunfire, and aircraft working together, was being refined into a deadly symphony. But beneath the careful planning lay memories of failure. Tarawa remained a warning. There, of the 125 LVTs deployed, more than half had been destroyed or disabled by the end of the first day. Many Marines remembered the horror of men clinging to the sides of vehicles, falling under machine gun fire, or drowning when a tractor was hit. At Saipan, commanders knew that success depended on delivering overwhelming force in the opening moments. The LVTs would not be a supplement. They would be the spearhead. To achieve this, numbers were crucial. More than 700 LVTs were allocated for Saipan, a staggering concentration. They would carry Marines across the reef in successive waves, resupply units once ashore, and even ferry wounded back to waiting hospital ships. The armored variants would advance alongside, blasting pillboxes with their howitzers. Behind them, Shermans would follow once engineers blasted paths through the reef. The assault would unfold like a machine in motion, each part reliant on the others. In the weeks before departure, ships at Pearl Harbor brimmed with vehicles, supplies, and men. The decks of transports groaned under the weight of stacked LVTs, their turrets covered in canvas, their tracks chained for the long voyage. On the eve of sailing, Marines painted names on the sides of their vehicles: Rough Rider, Hell's Boxcar, Lucky Lady. Superstition mixed with grim humor, a way to mask the fear of what awaited. In mid-May 1944, the invasion fleet sailed from Pearl Harbor. For days, the horizon was filled with ships, carriers, battleships, destroyers, and transports stretching as far as the eye could see. On the decks, Marines cleaned rifles, checked gear, and stared at the sea. Below decks, mechanics tended to the Amtraks, tightening bolts, checking engines, and oiling moving parts. The smell of fuel hung heavy in the air. One sergeant remarked, "It felt like the whole Pacific was moving with us. If we couldn't take Saipan with this, we couldn't take anything." By the time the fleet reached the Marianas in June, the preparations were complete. The amphibious arsenal had been forged. Machines, men, and doctrine fused into a weapon unlike any seen before. The lessons of Tarawa had been learned in blood, and now, on the eve of Saipan, those lessons would be put to the ultimate test. The Japanese had built their defenses to withstand waves of infantry. What awaited them instead was a tide of steel crawling inexorably through the surf, guns already firing before the first boots hit sand. The American preparations promised not just another landing, but a new form of amphibious warfare, one that would change the balance of the Pacific War forever. On the morning of June 13, 1944, the horizon off Saipan erupted in thunder. To the Japanese defenders peering through firing slits and camouflage netting, the sea seemed to have transformed into a floating city of steel. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers stretched as far as the eye could see, their guns already trained on the island. Operation Forager's invasion force, the most powerful fleet yet assembled in the Pacific, had arrived. At 05:45, the thunder began. From the deck of the USS Tennessee, 9 14-inch guns opened fire, each blast shaking the ship to its keel. Massive shells, each weighing nearly 1,500 pounds, screamed overhead before slamming into the ridges and beaches of Saipan. The USS California joined in, followed by the battleships Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New Mexico. The earth itself seemed to tremble as hundreds of shells tore into the island every hour. For 3 days, the bombardment continued. Cruisers like the USS Indianapolis and USS Birmingham steamed closer to the shoreline, their 8-inch guns raking the defenses. Destroyers darted in to deliver rapid barrages before slipping back behind the battle line. Overhead, aircraft from 15 carriers, Hellcats, Dauntlesses, and Avengers, swept inland, bombing Japanese airfields at Aslito and Marpi. Explosions rolled across the island in waves, setting cane fields ablaze and sending pillars of smoke into the sky. For the Marines and soldiers aboard the transports, the spectacle was both awe-inspiring and reassuring. Men crowded the rails to watch as mountains of earth and concrete seemed to vanish under the bombardment. One Marine private later recalled, "We thought nothing could live through that. The whole island was smoke and fire." Confidence grew that perhaps Saipan might fall more easily than feared. But below the smoke, the reality was different. Japanese defenders had dug deep into the island, constructing bunkers reinforced with concrete and timber, hidden caves, and underground shelters. For every bunker destroyed, another remained intact. Machine gun crews sat silent in their pillboxes, waiting. Artillerymen sheltered in caves, their guns rolled back under cover, ready to be pulled forward once the barrage lifted. General Saito had ordered his men not to waste ammunition on the bombardment. They were to endure and wait for the assault. The contrast was stark. On the surface, Saipan seemed a blasted ruin. Beneath the surface, the garrison remained very much alive. On June 14th, the second day of bombardment, American naval gunners adjusted their fire, concentrating on suspected strongpoints along the western beaches where the Marines would land. Navy spotter planes circled overhead, directing salvos onto pillboxes hidden among the dunes. Carrier aircraft strafed suspected trenches, while rocket-firing Avengers loosed salvos into cane fields. The shoreline became a patchwork of shattered craters and smoke-blackened trees. Still, many Japanese positions remained untouched. Later, Marine accounts would note that even after 3 days of bombardment, numerous pillboxes had never been hit. Camouflage, careful construction, and the sheer difficulty of identifying targets on a densely vegetated island had allowed much of the defense to survive. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, watched closely. His task was not only to support the landing, but to guard against the expected intervention of the Japanese combined fleet. Intelligence reports indicated that Japan's carriers were on the move, preparing to challenge the invasion. Spruance kept his fast carriers under Admiral Mark Mitcher at the ready, positioned to intercept any threat. It was a delicate balance. The fleet had to remain close enough to deliver firepower against Saipan, yet spread wide enough to respond to an enemy fleet action that could erupt at any hour. On June 15th, the third day of bombardment, the Navy unleashed its heaviest fire yet. Battleships closed to within 3,000 yards of shore, firing at point-blank range against visible strongpoints. Some ships risked grounding themselves on reefs to deliver more accurate salvos. The shoreline erupted in towering geysers of sand and smoke. Marines aboard landing craft rehearsed for the assault, engines idling as they circled in the waves, their eyes fixed on the island that loomed ever larger through the haze. The psychological effect on both sides was profound. For the Americans, confidence swelled. For the Japanese, the bombardment was both terrifying and numbing. One Japanese officer later wrote, "The bombardment was like the end of the world. Yet in our caves, we lived. When it ended, we were still here, and we prepared to fight." By the evening of June 15th, as the sun set over the Pacific, Saipan was shrouded in smoke and flame. Fires burned unchecked across the cane fields. The air was heavy with ash. From the transports offshore, Marines could smell the scorched earth carried on the breeze. Yet they knew the bombardment was only the beginning. Tomorrow, they would land. For all the destruction wrought, American commanders understood that many defenses remained. Experience from Tarawa and Kwajalein had taught them that bombardments rarely destroyed every bunker. Men would still have to fight, yard by yard, through pillboxes and caves. Still, the intent had been achieved. Japanese airfields were crippled, heavy coastal guns destroyed, and the defenders shaken. The stage was set. As night fell on June 15th, the invasion fleet spread into its final assault formation. Transport ships moved into position. LVTs were lowered into the sea. Marines loaded their rifles, checked grenades, and tightened straps. Officers gathered their men and reminded them of objectives: Red Beach, Green Beach, Blue Beach. Behind them, the great guns of the battleships fell silent, their barrels cooling after days of fire. Ahead of them, on shore, Japanese soldiers emerged from their shelters, dragging artillery back into position, checking ammunition, and sighting machine guns on the dark horizon. The bombardment had been the largest of the Pacific War to date, a storm of steel and fire intended to shatter Saipan's defenses. But in truth, it was only a prelude. Beneath the wreckage, the defenders still waited. And at dawn, when the landing craft churned forward through the surf, the real battle would begin. Dawn broke over the Pacific on June 15, 1944, to reveal a sight unmatched in the history of warfare. From horizon to horizon, the sea was filled with ships, transports, battleships, destroyers, and carriers, all converging on a single island barely 12 miles long. The invasion fleet, more than 500 vessels strong, represented the concentrated power of the United States Navy and Marine Corps. For the men aboard the transports, this was the day everything had led to, the assault on Saipan. At 0542, naval gunfire began once more, pounding the beaches where the Marines would land. The thunder of 14-inch guns from the USS Tennessee and USS California rolled over the waves, matched by salvos from cruisers and destroyers that edged perilously close to the reefs. The island disappeared in fire and smoke. But unlike the previous day's preparatory bombardment, this fire was timed and concentrated, meant to suppress Japanese positions in the critical minutes before the landings. At 0830, the signal was given. Waves of amphibious tractors, the ungainly steel-tracked LVTs, churned into motion, their engines roaring as they descended into the surf. Inside, Marines sat shoulder to shoulder, rifles clutched, faces taut with fear and determination. For many, it was their first combat landing. The smell of oil and seawater filled the cramped holds. Officers barked final orders over the roar of engines. "Keep moving! Hit the beach running! Don't bunch up!" As the LVTs advanced, naval gunfire lifted, shifting to inland targets. The curtain of bombardment rolled forward, leaving the beaches momentarily exposed. For the Japanese defenders, it was the signal to open fire. From pillboxes and caves that had survived the bombardment, machine guns and mortars came alive. A storm of bullets and shells tore into the oncoming waves of vehicles. Columns of water shot skyward as artillery rounds splashed into the sea. Some LVTs were struck directly, bursting into flame and sinking beneath the surf. Others ground forward through the torrent, their mounted machine guns answering with bursts of fire. On the left, the 2nd Marine Division advanced toward beaches code-named Red and Green. On the right, the 4th Marine Division headed for Blue Beach. Together, their objective was to secure a 4-mile-wide foothold. But the resistance was ferocious. Japanese gunners, having endured days underground, were ready. Artillery concealed in caves opened up with pre-sighted accuracy, hammering the surf zones where landing craft clustered. Entire squads were wiped out before reaching shore. For the men inside the LVTs, the experience was surreal. Shells struck the water all around them, sending spray through the open compartments. Some Marines prayed aloud. Others gripped their rifles in silence. One private later recalled, "It was like riding through hell. The water was boiling with bullets, and all you could do was hope your number wasn't up." As the first Amtraks reached the reefs, their tracks bit into coral, clawing forward where conventional landing craft would have been stranded. Machine gun turrets barked, raking pillboxes. The armored LVT A4s, with their 75mm howitzer turrets, began firing even before reaching dry sand, shells exploding against bunkers and trenches. Japanese defenders, stunned to see tanks rising from the sea, hesitated. They had never imagined that armor could cross the reefs. In those moments of hesitation, the Marines gained their first foothold. But the price was terrible. Many Amtraks were knocked out in the surf, their burning hulks drifting with the current. Marines tumbled into the water, weighed down by packs and rifles. Some drowned before reaching shore. Others dragged themselves through the shallows under fire, waves stained with blood. Corpsmen waded into the chaos, pulling wounded men to safety, often falling themselves. The beaches became littered with bodies, wreckage, and burning machines. Yet the LVTs pressed on. At Red Beach 2, armored tractors rumbled directly up to Japanese pillboxes, firing point-blank into firing slits. Barbed wire and obstacles were crushed under their tracks. Behind them, Marines leapt into the sand, advancing in short rushes, grenades and flamethrowers in hand. At Blue Beach, where resistance was, the sight of tanks crawling out of the surf was incomprehensible. Yet discipline held. They fought until overrun. By mid-morning, hundreds of LVTs had deposited Marines across the beaches. The air was filled with smoke, sand, and the constant din of gunfire. Sherman tanks, brought ashore on landing ships once beachheads were established, began to join the battle, providing heavier firepower. Engineers cleared mines and obstacles under fire, opening lanes for armor and supplies. Naval gunfire continued to pound ridgelines overlooking the beaches, but Japanese artillery still struck back, inflicting punishing casualties. At one point, a Japanese counter-battery gun found its range and struck among the landing craft offshore, destroying several in succession. Yet the American fleet responded immediately, cruisers turning their guns to silence the source. The interplay of naval power and amphibious assault was constant, each element supporting the other. By early afternoon, footholds had been secured, though tenuous. The 2nd Marine Division had pushed inland as far as 1,000 yards in places, while the 4th Division fought bitterly to expand its perimeter. Casualties were severe. Nearly 2,000 Americans were killed or wounded on the first day alone. Bodies lay scattered along the tide line, evidence of the ferocity of the defense. Yet despite the bloodshed, the landing had succeeded. A beachhead had been established on Saipan. As the sun dipped low in the sky, Marines dug shallow foxholes in the sand, bracing for the inevitable counterattack. Ammunition was distributed, flamethrowers refueled, and machine guns emplaced. Offshore, the fleet stood vigilant, destroyers firing illumination rounds to light the night sky. Onshore, Japanese soldiers prepared to strike back, infiltrating through cane fields and gullies. For the Marines, the first night would be one of tension. Every rustle in the dark, potentially the start of a banzai charge. By nightfall, the scale of the achievement began to sink in. Despite days of bombardment failing to fully neutralize defenses, despite the fury of artillery and machine guns, the amphibious armor had proven decisive. The LVTs had carried men directly onto the beaches, neutralized key strongpoints, and preserved the momentum of the assault. Without them, the Marines might have faced another Tarawa, a slaughter in the surf. Instead, Saipan was breached. The cost had been high, and the struggle inland would be even bloodier. But the decisive moment had come in those first hours of June 15th, when the steel beasts rose from the sea, clawed over the reefs, and carried the first waves of Marines into the teeth of Saipan's defenses. The turning point had been reached, and the battle for the Marianas was now fully joined. By the evening of June 15, 1944, the Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions clung to a fragile beachhead along the western coast of Saipan. Behind them, the Pacific rolled under the silhouettes of warships, still vigilant and ready to fire at a moment's notice. Before them stretched a landscape scarred by bombardment, cane fields, shattered villages, and ridgelines where Japanese defenders still waited. The foothold was won, but the true battle for Saipan was only beginning. During the night, Japanese artillery harassed the beaches, forcing exhausted Marines to dig deeper foxholes and seek shelter in shell craters. Flares lit the sky as sporadic counterattacks probed the perimeter. Men gripped rifles nervously, firing at shadows, their nerves raw from the day's slaughter. Yet the line held, and with dawn came the next phase, the push inland. With the beaches secure enough to permit heavier landings, American engineers blasted channels through the reefs, allowing LSTs, landing ship, tank, to bring Sherman medium tanks ashore. By June 16th, Shermans rumbled forward, their 75mm guns trained on ridges and tree lines. For the Marines who had survived the landing under fire, the sight of Shermans was a welcome reassurance. One corporal recalled, "When those tanks rolled off the beach, we finally felt like we had some real muscle on our side." The Shermans quickly encountered Japanese armor. General Saito had reserved a small but determined tank force, around 40 Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, supported by lighter vehicles. By the standards of Europe, the clash was small. But in the Pacific, where terrain usually denied armored warfare, it was extraordinary. On June 17th, near the village of Garapan, Shermans and Chihas met in one of the few tank battles of the Pacific War. The Chiha, introduced in the late 1930s, was lightly armored and undergunned compared to the Sherman. Its 57mm gun was designed for infantry support, not tank duels. Against the Sherman's 75mm cannon and thicker armor, the Chiha was badly outmatched. The clash was brief but brutal. Shermans knocked out Japanese tanks at long range, their shells igniting fuel and ammunition. Crews who bailed out were cut down by Marine infantry following close behind. Yet the Japanese fought with determination, maneuvering through cane fields and attempting to flank. One Sherman was immobilized by a well-placed shot, its crew forced to abandon it under fire. Though the American tanks emerged victorious, the battle revealed the challenges of the terrain. Cane fields and coral ridges made maneuver difficult. Tanks could easily bog down or be ambushed at close range by infantry armed with satchel charges and anti-tank mines. Cooperation between armor and infantry was essential. Marines advanced beside the Shermans, rooting out ambushes and protecting them from close assault. The tankers, in turn, blasted pillboxes and strongpoints that infantry could not approach. While the Shermans pushed forward, the LVTs remained vital. No longer spearheading the assault, they now became the lifeline of the beachhead, ferrying ammunition, water, and rations across the reef, and evacuating the wounded back to hospital ships. Many of these vehicles bore scars from the landing, shrapnel holes, bent armor plates, and improvised repairs welded by Seabees. Yet they continued to grind through the surf, their tracks cutting grooves into the sand as they sustained the advance. The Japanese, unwilling to yield, launched ferocious counterattacks. At night, the battlefield transformed into chaos. On June 16th, and again on the 17th, waves of infantry charged American positions under cover of darkness. These were not tentative probes, but banzai charges, full-scale assaults driven by the doctrine of death before surrender. Flares fired into the sky revealed hundreds of figures rushing through cane fields, screaming war cries. Marines braced behind machine guns, BARs, and rifles, unleashing torrents of fire. Tracer rounds stitched across the darkness. Mortars dropped shells into advancing ranks. Still, the Japanese pressed forward, hurling grenades and swinging bayonets. The fighting was intimate and savage. Foxholes became islands of survival, Marines firing until barrels overheated, then grabbing carbines or even knives to repel attackers. Corpsmen worked frantically, dragging the wounded back under fire. By dawn, fields were littered with bodies, the ground soaked in blood. The charges had been broken, but at heavy cost. By day, the advance inland was a grinding affair. Villages had to be cleared house by house. Caves in the cliffs were blasted with explosives or seared with flamethrowers. Every ridge became a battleground. Japanese artillery, though diminished, still struck with deadly effect, targeting supply routes and concentrations of troops. Snipers concealed in palm trees or ruined buildings harassed advancing units, forcing Marines to remain constantly alert. The toll on both sides mounted steadily. American casualty lists grew daily, with hundreds killed and thousands wounded in the first week alone. Japanese losses were even higher, but their resolve showed no cracks. General Saito urged his men to fight on, declaring that Saipan must become a graveyard of the American Marines. Each counterattack, each stubborn defense, reflected that fatal determination. And yet, inexorably, the Americans pressed forward. With Shermans and artillery leading the way, supported by naval gunfire and airstrikes from carriers offshore, the Marines advanced village by village, ridge by ridge. It was a battle of attrition, one that favored American firepower and logistics. By June 20th, the Marines had pushed inland several miles, threatening the island's airfield and driving wedges between Japanese defensive positions. The cost had been immense, but the momentum was irreversible. Saipan's defenders had failed to drive the invaders back into the sea. Now they faced a slow but steady annihilation, as American armor and infantry ground forward across their island fortress. For the Marines who fought through those days, the memory remained vivid. One sergeant later wrote, "The nights were the worst. You never knew when the screaming would start. But when daylight came, the tanks were there, and we knew we could keep moving." That balance, terror by night, grinding progress by day, defined the push inland on Saipan. By early July 1944, the battle for Saipan had dragged on for more than 3 weeks. The Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions, alongside the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division, had clawed their way north across the island. Villages had been reduced to rubble, ridges shattered by artillery, and cane fields burned to ash. Yet Japanese resistance, though steadily compressed, had not collapsed. General Yoshitsugu Saito and Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the latter already a symbol of Japan's waning naval power, now faced the inevitable. Supplies were gone, ammunition dwindling, and casualties catastrophic. By July 6, more than 20,000 Japanese soldiers had been killed. Fewer than 3,000 effectives remained to hold the final defensive line at the northern tip of the island. Saito knew the battle was lost. Wounded filled caves and makeshift hospitals. Civilians starved or huddled in terror, awaiting the end. In his final order of the day, Saito invoked the ancient code of Gyokusai, honorable death. We shall advance to attack the American devils and leave our bones on Saipan as a bulwark of the Pacific. For the defenders, there would be no surrender, no retreat. Only one act remained: to die in a final assault. At dawn on July 7, 1944, the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War began. From the cane fields and cliffs of Marpy Point, A tide of men surged forward. There were perhaps 3,000 in total, not only infantry, but also wounded soldiers leaning on crutches, doctors from field hospitals, even clerks and engineers armed with rifles, pistols, or bayonets tied to poles. Officers drew their swords and led the way, banners fluttering in the rising sun. The cries of "Tenno Heika Banzai," "Long live the Emperor," echoed across the plain. The American front lines were held that morning by elements of the 105th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. Army's 27th Division. Many soldiers were weary from weeks of fighting. They awoke to the sound of gunfire and shouting, to the sight of hundreds of Japanese rushing through the haze. Entire companies were caught off guard. Machine guns opened up, cutting swaths through the charging masses. Bar gunners fired until their magazines were empty, quickly reloading, then firing again. Mortar crews dropped round after round into the advancing horde. But the Japanese pressed on, climbing over the bodies of their comrades, hurling grenades, slashing with bayonets. The momentum of sheer numbers broke through sections of the American line. Hand-to-hand combat erupted. Foxholes were overrun, their occupants bayoneted or shot at close range. Soldiers fought with rifle butts, knives, even fists. One American officer later recalled, "They came like a tidal wave, and for a moment, we were swallowed by it." The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry were devastated, losing over 650 men killed or wounded within hours. Yet discipline held. Surviving companies fell back to secondary positions, machine gunners dragging their weapons into new fields of fire. Artillery observers called in devastating barrages, shells bursting among the charging ranks. Shermans rolled forward, their 75-millimeter guns blasting into dense clusters of men. Flamethrowers seared through underbrush where attackers tried to infiltrate. Slowly, inexorably, the tide was turned back. Still, the assault did not end quickly. For nearly 15 hours, waves of Japanese fighters hurled themselves against the American line. By mid-afternoon, the ground before the 27th Infantry's positions was littered with thousands of bodies. Machine gun barrels glowed red. Water-cooled Brownings steaming as crews poured canteen water over them to keep firing. The acrid stench of gunpowder and burning flesh hung over the battlefield. As dusk fell, the last organized attacks faltered. Survivors, many wounded, crawled into gullies or caves where they either took their own lives or prepared to die in place. Among them was General Saito himself. Mortally wounded, he committed ritual suicide within his headquarters cave. Vice Admiral Nagumo, once the architect of Pearl Harbor, also took his life, ending the careers of two men who had defined Japan's early successes in the Pacific. For the Americans, the scale of the charge was almost beyond comprehension. Never before had so many men thrown themselves knowingly into certain death. The 105th Infantry's losses were staggering. More than 900 casualties, one of the highest regimental tolls in the Pacific War. Yet they had held. The Japanese force had been annihilated. The final organized resistance on Saipan was broken. The aftermath was grim. Photographs taken by Marine combat correspondents show the battlefield as a carpet of bodies, row upon row of fallen soldiers, many still clutching rifles or swords. American soldiers moved among them cautiously, wary of wounded who sometimes rose to attack in a last act of defiance. Corpsmen tended to the injured, while bulldozers began the grim task of burying the dead. This final Banzai charge was more than just a military episode. It was a cultural and psychological marker. It demonstrated the extraordinary resolve of Japanese soldiers to die for the emperor, and the futility of such tactics against America's overwhelming firepower. It also foreshadowed the even more desperate resistance that would later be seen on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. For the Americans, it was both a sobering reminder of their enemy's determination and a grim validation of their own doctrine of mechanized, coordinated warfare. By July 9th, Saipan was officially declared secure. The last Japanese soldiers either lay dead on the field or committed suicide in the caves and cliffs at the island's northern tip. The Banzai Charge of July 7th had been their final act, a desperate gamble that achieved only more death. Yet for those who survived it, the memory endured. One Marine later reflected, "I've seen a lot of fighting, but never anything like that. They came at us with everything they had left. It was bravery, it was madness, and it was the end." The largest Banzai Charge of the Pacific War had ended not in glory, but in annihilation. Saipan was lost to Japan, and with it, the last illusions of an impregnable defense. The path to Japan itself now lay open. By the second week of July 1944, organized Japanese resistance on Saipan had collapsed. The Great Banzai Charge had consumed the last reserves of General Saito's garrison, leaving the shattered remnants to scatter into caves and ravines. For the United States, victory was all but assured. But even as the battle drew to a close, a new and haunting tragedy unfolded, one not measured in tactical maps or casualty reports, but in the despair of civilians caught between two empires. Saipan was not an uninhabited fortress. When American troops landed, more than 20,000 civilians lived on the island. Japanese settlers, Okinawans, Koreans conscripted for labor, and native Chamorro islanders whose lives had been subsumed into Tokyo's colonial rule. Many of these families had farmed the sugarcane fields or worked in factories that supported Japan's war effort. For years, they had lived under strict military administration, saturated with propaganda that portrayed Americans as monsters who would kill, rape, and enslave any who fell into their hands. As American forces pushed north, families were driven ahead of the retreating soldiers. Mothers clutched children. The elderly stumbled along rough trails. Leaflets and radio broadcasts from Japanese commanders urged civilians to resist capture, warning that surrender meant torture and dishonor. The militarist ideology that demanded death before surrender for soldiers now extended to the civilians. Better to die as martyrs, they were told, than to live in shame. By July 9th, American patrols reached the cliffs of Marpi Point at the island's northern tip. There, with the Pacific stretching endlessly below, thousands of civilians had gathered. Marines approaching cautiously saw scenes that chilled them. Families clustered at the cliff edge, women weeping, men shouting patriotic slogans, children crying. American interpreters with loudspeakers pleaded with them to come down, assuring them of safety, food, and shelter. Leaflets dropped from aircraft promised humane treatment. Some civilians hesitated, torn between fear and hope. Others refused even to listen. What followed became one of the most haunting episodes of the Pacific War. Convinced by years of indoctrination that Americans would kill them, hundreds, then thousands, leapt from the cliffs into the sea. Parents carried children in their arms as they jumped. Families held hands and stepped together into the abyss. Those who survived the plunge were dashed against rocks or drowned in the surf. Marines on the beach below stood helpless, some wading into the water to try and rescue survivors, only to be met with terror or resistance. The tragedy continued for days. At Bonsai Cliff and nearby Suicide Cliff, mass suicides occurred in waves. Civilians poured gasoline over themselves and set fires. Others used grenades. Some begged soldiers for weapons to kill themselves when they could not find another means. American troops tried desperately to prevent it, firing warning shots into the air, rushing forward to pull families away from the brink. But fear ran deeper than persuasion. A Marine officer later wrote, "We shouted ourselves hoarse, telling them they would be safe, but they looked at us as if we were demons." Newsreel cameramen and photographers documented the aftermath. Images of women cradling lifeless children, bodies floating in the surf, and smoke rising from the cliffs shocked viewers back home. The footage would become enduring evidence of the power of militarist propaganda and the human cost of total war. For the Americans, the suicides were both incomprehensible and deeply unsettling. They had expected to fight soldiers, not to watch entire families hurl themselves to their deaths. Commanders redoubled efforts to save lives, ordering interpreters to broadcast reassurances and setting up refugee camps with food and medical aid. Some civilians did surrender, particularly Koreans and Chamorros who distrusted Japanese rule. They emerged weak, malnourished, and terrified, but grateful to be alive. Yet thousands more chose death. The tragedy at Marpy Point illustrated the stark contrast between mechanized warfare and human despair. Amphibious tanks, naval gunfire, and air power had shattered Saipan's defenses with overwhelming force. Yet against propaganda and fear, even that immense arsenal could do little. The steel machines that carried Marines across the reefs could not reach the hearts and minds of civilians who had been taught to believe that death was preferable to capture. In the aftermath, American medical personnel and chaplains tended to survivors. Orphaned children were carried to field hospitals, their parents lost on the cliffs. Graves were dug, and the bodies of civilians were laid to rest alongside soldiers. For many Marines and soldiers, the memory of Saipan was not only of combat, but of the terrible cries that echoed from the cliffs as families chose death over life. The mass suicides shocked the American public when reports filtered home. Newspapers struggled to convey the scale of the tragedy. For Japanese leaders, it was presented as proof of national loyalty, civilians sacrificing themselves for the emperor. But to many outside Japan, it revealed the destructive power of militarist ideology and foreshadowed what might come if the United States had to invade the Japanese home islands themselves. By July 9th, Saipan was declared secure. The battle had cost more than 3,000 American dead and 13,000 wounded. Nearly all of the 30,000 Japanese defenders were killed, and among the civilians, thousands were dead by their own hand. Saipan was a battlefield, but it was also a graveyard for soldiers and for the innocents caught in between. On July 9, 1944, the island of Saipan was declared secure. After nearly a month of ferocious combat, the last organized Japanese resistance had been annihilated. For the United States, the announcement marked not only the conclusion of one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, but also the opening of a new chapter, one whose consequences would reverberate all the way to Tokyo. The cost of victory was staggering. American forces suffered over 3,400 killed and nearly 13,000 wounded. For the Marines and soldiers who survived, the end brought little celebration. The beaches and ridges of Saipan were littered with the wreckage of war, burnt-out Shermans, shattered LVTs, and the graves of comrades hastily marked with crosses or helmets on rifles. Men who had fought through cane fields and caves sat in silence, too exhausted to cheer. One Marine private remembered, "We didn't feel like victors. We felt like survivors." For Japan, the defeat was catastrophic. Nearly 30,000 soldiers had died in the defense of Saipan. The garrison had been wiped out almost to the last man, while thousands of civilians perished in mass suicides or in the chaos of the fighting. The scale of the disaster stunned the Japanese high command. For the first time in the war, the home islands themselves were directly threatened. Saipan was part of the inner defensive perimeter. Its loss meant that Japan's shield had been pierced. The political consequences in Tokyo were immediate. Prime Minister General Hideki Tojo, who had led Japan since 1941, faced growing opposition even before Saipan fell. When news of the defeat reached the emperor, the government could no longer withstand the outcry. On July 18th, Tojo and his cabinet resigned. The fall of Saipan had shaken the very foundations of Japan's leadership. It was no longer possible to claim that victory might still be won. For the United States, Saipan's capture delivered strategic rewards far beyond the island itself. The Marianas, with their open plains and proximity to Japan, provided the perfect bases for the U.S. Army Air Force's new long-range bomber, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. From Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, these massive aircraft could strike Tokyo and the industrial heartland of Japan directly. Within months, fleets of B-29s would take off from newly built airstrips, carrying tons of bombs across the Pacific. Japan's cities would burn under their onslaught. The path from Saipan led directly to the firebombing of Tokyo, the destruction of Japan's industry, and ultimately, the atomic bombings that ended the war. The battle also validated American doctrine. The integration of naval power, amphibious armor, air support, and marine and army infantry had succeeded against one of the most heavily defended islands in the Pacific. The LVTs, once doubted and ridiculed, had proven their worth by carrying armor and firepower directly across the reefs. The Shermans had broken Japanese counterattacks. Naval gunfire and carrier aircraft had supported the advance with relentless pressure. The lessons of Tarawa had been absorbed, and on Saipan, the United States demonstrated that it could execute complex amphibious operations with overwhelming success. Yet amid these achievements, the human toll remained searing. Survivors spoke less of strategy and more of faces remembered, comrades who had fallen in the surf or disappeared in the night banzai charges. Army units of the 27th Division, which had borne the brunt of the final Japanese assault, mourned entire companies lost in a single morning. Marines reflected on the suicides at Marpy Point, unable to comprehend the despair that had driven civilians to leap into the sea. The victory, though decisive, was laced with sorrow. For many who fought there, Saipan was a turning point in personal as well as military terms. Veterans described it as the battle where the war's scale became undeniable, not just skirmishes on distant atolls, but a direct clash that reshaped the Pacific. One Marine captain recalled, "We knew when Saipan fell, Japan was doomed. The only question was how long it would take, and how many more of us would die before the end." The war did not pause. Even as Saipan was declared secure, planning began for the assaults on Tinian and Guam, and further ahead, the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Each would be bloodier still. Yet Saipan had broken the myth of Japan's invulnerability. The emperor's cabinet had fallen, the home islands lay within range of American bombers, and the balance of the Pacific had irreversibly shifted. On Saipan's beaches, Marines cleaned their rifles and prepared to move on. Naval Seabees began constructing massive airfields that would soon launch the bombers of WW2 Bomber Command. Graves were dug, marked, and catalogued, while survivors wrote letters home, often unable to capture the horror of what they had seen. The island, once envisioned by Tokyo as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, now belonged to the United States, a fortress turned against its builders. The consequences of Saipan's capture would echo until the war's final days. It was not simply another island conquered in the march across the Pacific. It was the moment when Japan's leaders understood that defeat was no longer avoidable, and when America gained the means to strike at the enemy's very heart. The battle had cost dearly, but in the calculus of global war, Saipan was a decisive step toward victory. And for those who fought there, it would remain etched forever in memory, a place of fire, sacrifice, and the heavy weight of consequence. When the guns finally fell silent on Saipan in July 1944, the island stood as both a victory and a warning. For the United States, it was a vindication of doctrine, technology, and perseverance. For Japan, it was a devastating revelation that its defensive line could be breached, that its homeland lay exposed, and that the tide of the war had turned irreversibly. Yet beyond strategy and politics, the battle left behind something more tangible: the enduring legacy of amphibious mechanization, embodied in the ungainly, steel-tracked vehicles that had risen from the sea. The landing vehicle, tracked, the LVT, was not designed for glory. Its box-like hull and rattling tracks earned it nicknames like alligators or Amtraks, terms that underscored its awkwardness. At first, many within the U.S. military dismissed it as impractical, too fragile for battle, too strange to fit within traditional doctrine. But on the reefs of Saipan, the LVT came into its own. Where conventional landing craft would have faltered, stranded by coral or torn apart by machine gun fire, the LVTs crawled forward, armor belching fire, their treads biting into terrain that seemed impassable. It was not the first time they had been tested. At Tarawa, the few LVTs available had carried Marines across reefs under fire, saving lives even as many were destroyed. That lesson had been learned in blood. By the time of Saipan, the U.S. had invested in producing hundreds of improved models, including the armored LVT A4 mounting a 75mm howitzer turret. At Saipan, these vehicles were no longer supporting actors. They were the vanguard, the first to cross the reef, the first to fire upon the beaches, the first to shield Marines as they poured ashore. Their impact was decisive. Japanese commanders had built their defenses on the assumption that armor could not reach the beaches. When LVTs rumbled out of the surf and onto the sand, guns blazing, that assumption collapsed. Bunkers and pillboxes that had been designed to slaughter waves of infantry were instead blasted apart by mechanized firepower. The psychological effect was as powerful as the tactical one. Japanese gunners, stunned to see tanks rise from the ocean, hesitated. Marines, emboldened by the armor beside them, pressed forward with determination. Saipan thus became the proving ground for mechanized amphibious warfare. It demonstrated that the integration of naval bombardment, carrier-based airstrikes, amphibious armor, and infantry could overcome even the most formidable island defenses. The synergy of sea, air, and ground power, choreographed into a single operation, was the hallmark of modern combined arms warfare. In this sense, Saipan was not just a Pacific Island battle. It was a blueprint for the amphibious doctrine that would carry forward into future conflicts. From Saipan, the lessons carried on. At Tinian and Guam, LVTs again spearheaded landings, grinding through reefs and delivering Marines directly into combat. At Peleliu, despite appalling casualties, the vehicles played a critical role in breaching heavily fortified coral ridges. At Iwo Jima and Okinawa, amphibious tractors ferried men and supplies under fire, keeping the assault moving despite terrain and resistance. The ungainly alligators had become indispensable. Beyond their tactical role, the LVTs represented something larger: the ability of American industry to adapt and innovate at a staggering pace. Within 2 years, a civilian rescue craft had been transformed into a war machine. Factories across the United States churned out hundreds of vehicles each month, while engineers refined armor plating, armament, and reliability. The LVT was not the sleekest or most glamorous of weapons, but it was emblematic of the industrial might that underpinned American victory. For Japan, the shock of Saipan was profound. The empire had believed that the Marianas formed an impregnable shield. Its planners had trusted in reefs, fortifications, and the willingness of defenders to die in place. They had underestimated the ingenuity of their opponent, and the result was catastrophic. The fall of Saipan triggered the collapse of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government, the resignation of his cabinet, and a recognition, though not yet admission, that the war could not be won. From the cliffs of Saipan, Japan could glimpse the inevitability of defeat. The consequences unfolded quickly. With Saipan in American hands, airfields were built at breakneck speed. Within months, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress was flying missions from the Marianas, delivering the first strategic bombing campaign against Japan itself. Cities burned, factories were destroyed, and the war's center of gravity shifted inexorably toward the Japanese homeland. Saipan's capture was not just another victory. It was the hinge upon which the Pacific War turned. Yet amid these sweeping changes, the legacy of Saipan also endured at the human level. Veterans of the battle carried memories of the Amtraks, the roar of their engines in the surf, the cover they provided against machine gun fire, the sight of their hulks burning on the beach. Many owed their lives to the ungainly machines. Marines who had once laughed at their awkward appearance came to regard them with respect, even affection. One veteran recalled, "We cursed the rattling, stinking things when they broke down. But when they took us across the reef at Saipan, we knew we couldn't have made it without them." Today, the remnants of that legacy remain. In the lagoons of Saipan, rusting hulks of LVTs still lie where they sank, their outlines softened by coral and time. Divers swim among their skeletal frames, exploring silent witnesses to the day when they carried Marines into history. For historians, they are artifacts of innovation. For veterans, they were lifelines. For the islanders, they are reminders of the devastation that swept across their home. The Battle of Saipan is remembered as one of the turning points of the Pacific War, a clash that toppled governments, opened the path to Japan, and revealed the devastating synergy of modern warfare. Yet within that larger story lies the tale of the amphibious tank, the machine that defied expectations, broke the myth of the reef barrier, and became the spearhead of America's advance. In the long view of history, Saipan was more than a battlefield. It was a crucible in which doctrine, technology, and human endurance were tested together. The LVT, once dismissed as ungainly and impractical, became the unlikely hero of that crucible. Its tracks carved not only the sands of Saipan, but also the future of amphibious warfare. As the documentary closes, we return to the image of the rusting hulks in Saipan's lagoons. Coral encrusts their armor, Fish swim through their hollow interiors, and sunlight filters down in shifting beams. They are silent now, their guns mute, their engines stilled. Yet they remain as enduring witnesses to the moment when armored machines rose from the sea, carried men through fire, and helped change the course of the Pacific War forever.